what's going to happen when the Chinese economy collapses, which is very likely. What will happen when the Russian Federation breaks up? We just don't know what is going to happen. We certainly realized it when the war started in Ukraine with the massive flood of refugees into Europe. And that's just one of many floods that we could possibly face in the future.
So in this episode, we're talking with Patrick Johnstone, who is a well-known author in the Christian world, well-known for writing the book Operation World, first in the 1960s, which has then been republished and updated many times since then. A really faithful, faith-filled servant of God who we've had the privilege as having one of Welcome Church's trustees over the last few years. He came and spoke to us, didn't he, at our team retreat last year. And we joked after that he's a bit like the David Attenborough of the Christian world, that he has, he's had so much experience serving in missions fields, in different mission organizations and different contexts over the years. And now is wanting to kind of impart his knowledge and impart some of the things that he sees for the future in others. And we've been blessed to be some of the people that he has been speaking to and feeding into in terms of where he sees the global church going and how we need to be prepared to respond for future world issues.
Yeah, exactly. It's been such a privilege to have him as a trustee. And as you say, the retreat last year was amazing just to have him for a whole session and be able to hear his wisdom. And he's really spoken in to Welcome Churches in terms of, we have always said we are agile. We want to have an agility whereby we respond to things happening in terms of immigration. Sometimes it's expected and sometimes it's unexpected. But Patrick has really encouraged us also to look at politics, look at migration on a worldwide basis, and to see what might be coming, so that we at Welcome Churches can be prepared and can plan well, so that we can really serve and equip the church in the UK in a really relevant and a really, really good way, so that they are then ready to respond as well.
Yeah, definitely. And there are so many things that are inspiring about Patrick. And we have really appreciated, haven't we, just his godliness and the faith that he has brought to Welcome Churches, for us to be seeking God in everything we're doing, and seeking his wisdom above everything else has been so important to us, and in terms of our foundations and how we've built the organisation. We've really appreciated his character, haven't we?
Exactly. And having a trustee who speaks into the prayer life of Welcome Churches and our own spiritual lives, and encouraging us in our own walks with God as leaders, and as part of a Christian charity, has been just really encouraging to us, spurred us on to be the best that we can be. Really, so we've really appreciated that. And I think there's just so much. We could talk to Patrick for months and not run out of really interesting topics to talk about. So this podcast, we've dipped in and out of a few things that we hope will be interesting to you. Patrick's books are available if you want to read more, but we really hope that this conversation in the podcast today will be an encouragement to you and be just really insightful to get a chance to hear from Patrick Johnstone himself. So enjoy today's episode. With me today in the podcast is well-known missionary, evangelist, intercessor, researcher, and author Patrick Johnstone. When I was younger, we were both part of the same church. And although I didn't get to know Patrick then, I did purchase his book, Operation World. And at that time, it was a kind of Christian handbook that many of us loved delving into and learning from. And because of which, I think many Christians were inspired to leave the UK and to serve overseas in the countries that we had read about, to be a light for Christ, and sharing our faith in countries with no or very little Christian witness. And I know I was one of those, and Operation World played a part in that vision and that decision to do that. And over the years, Patrick has researched and written many articles and books, including some of which might be better known to listeners, The Future of the Global Church and Serving God in a Migrant Crisis. And he's currently working on a series of articles on the Sahel region of Africa, which we're going to talk about later today. So welcome to Love the Stranger podcast, Patrick.
Thank you.
Really great to have you today. I think I'm going to have you do most of the talking because I'm really interested in all that you have got to say. And to start off with, in your book, Serving God in a Migrant Crisis, one of the chapters is titled The Immigrant in the Mirror. And you allude to the fact that probably most of us have ancestors who've migrated from one place to another. And I know that's true of you and your family too. Do you want to tell us, just to start off, a bit of your own background and a bit of your life? A quick summary of many years.
I've grown up in the UK, in England, and so culturally I'm very English. But I often laughingly say I haven't got any English blood in me at all. My surname is Scottish. My father had an Irish passport. He was a GP, and his father too, and they migrated from Ireland, or my grandfather did, and my father was born in this country. And then he met my mother on a skiing holiday in Lapland. And she is
fantastic.
And so I'm half Dutch. And if I look back in my pedigree, we can take our pedigree back to the 900s to a Viking chieftain who lived in the north of Holland.
That's amazing.
So we're all a mixture.
We are. And you yourself also, in terms of your culture and your life, you have also been mixed up into other cultures and other countries. Can you tell us a little bit about that
Very
as well?
much so. It was when I was at university in Bristol, preparing to be a research scientist, that God spoke to me about my need of Him. And it was through a friend who led me to Jesus, and that set me on a totally different course. I ended up being called to Africa, and I went out as a young man of 24 to serve as an evangelist in the slums of southern Africa. So I was one of the early city missionaries. But we had a multilingual situation. And during my 16 years in Africa, I learned a bit or a lot of 10 languages. And then I've subsequently learned others. And at the moment I'm learning Farsi. And so I have all that mix. And I often feel how inadequate English is because there are so many things that I could say better in another language.
Yes. And I think sometimes when something happened in another language, it's hard then to retell it in English when it happened in something else.
Yes. Yeah.
And then in terms of coming back to the UK, I think we've sometimes spoken together about reverse culture shock and perhaps the effect on your family. Can you talk a bit about that before we get into some other
We had the 16 years in
topics.
Africa,
Mm-hmm.
and then we actually had an interim with a year on the OM ship, the MV Logos, and we traveled through Asia and the Pacific. And so that gave me a global perspective. And all our children were born in Africa. And so they came to the UK very different to their peers at school. And Peter himself, he was nicknamed the religious professor. And he said, well, I don't mind being persecuted, being Christian at school, but I do object to it at church. He found that many of his peers in the church were rather anti-Christian, but had to go because of their parents. And so he would sit in our church at Gold Hill, and he wanted to hear the adults' message. So we all had culture shock.
Yes, I definitely echo that in our own family, and having been sent out by Gold Hill Church and then coming back and having to adjust as a whole family, even the things that how we're family together is different and it's been enriched, and then you have to try and replant that back in the UK. Yeah, really interesting topics that I'd love just to chat with you about, but we do have other things to talk about today. And we're very blessed that Patrick is one of the founding trustees of Welcome Churches. And some listeners might have heard him speak at our Welcome Conference last year. And very much we value his wisdom, both in terms of Welcome Churches and also his spiritual wisdom to us, myself and Emily, as we lead Welcome Churches. So Patrick, you've spent a lifetime really learning and researching about global trends, both in the spiritual sense, but also in terms of political and economic and climate factors that lead to migration across the world. And many listeners will be interested in your thoughts about some of the different mass migrations here to the UK.
One of the things that we face in the world today is a breakdown of a world that we've known really for the last 200 years. One of the unexpected effects of the Industrial Revolution was that Britain became a naval power that was able to influence the whole world. But with the moral change that came in the revival in Britain, came this remarkable desire to extinguish the thing that had made us wealthy, slavery. And we managed to get the whole world to agree to stop official slave trading. And so the Pax Britannica gave an amazing opportunity for the gospel, and also to pave the way for the globalization under Pax Americana after World War II. And so the trading world got going, but then all that is breaking down. And we are seeing a rising tide in the number of people moving their country because of disasters or huge economic difficulties. And my concern was in the early part of this century was that this is only going to become more and more of a challenge as the population continues to grow, for a bit at least. And those pressures come from many directions. And one of the ones that has happened as a result of the COVID catastrophe and of the terrible attack of Russia on Ukraine is the whole economic order of the world has been tipped into crisis. And so the level of migration will inevitably increase. For instance, I'm writing this article on the Sahel, which incidentally is that area of grassland south of the Sahara Desert, or it's really a lot of it is semi-desert. But we hardly hear anything about what is happening in that part of Africa south of the Sahara Desert. And the reason is that all the missionaries, or almost all, have had to leave. Reporters aren't there because they could be kidnapped. The military forces that try and tame the ISIS insurgencies have had to leave because the governments don't like them. And the whole area is descending into chaos. And so even as we speak, we are seeing a massively increased flow of folk from North Africa to Europe. And so this is just one component of a global problem. What's going to happen when the Chinese economy collapses, which is very likely? What will happen when the Russian Federation breaks up? We just don't know what is going to happen. We certainly realized it when the war started in Ukraine with the massive flood of refugees into Europe. And that's just one of many floods that we could possibly face in the future.
Yes. What do you think the factors are that will affect where we're heading in the next years? There's a number of specific factors that will play into why people migrate and the kinds of migration that we're seeing. Some of the headlines for where we are heading in, let's say, the next 20 or 25 years. And I know you've put a lot of thought into this topic.
Well, the breakdown of social order and many failed states is one factor. There is also the problem of food. There is just not enough food if there is not enough fertilizer being distributed around the world for crops. Africa is totally dependent on imports of fertilizer to grow enough crops. And then we have the increasing pressure on rivers. There is almost a war situation along the Nile at the moment. There is threat on it because Egypt is afraid that Ethiopia will take more water out of the Nile than they can afford to allow, because they depend on the water that comes from Ethiopia for the life of Egypt. And so we see the same in Pakistan. That country is rapidly growing in population and will continue to grow for some time, but they depend on one river, which they don't fully own. And what's going to happen if that fails? So there's a factors, and there are several others that I could list, but we face a crisis with multiple facets at the moment in the world that is destabilizing. We must see these waves as an opportunity too.
Yeah. Exactly. And as we look with kingdom eyes, we see God's hand in all of this, and his hand on the planet and on different things that are happening, and his hand in bringing people into countries where they can hear the gospel, where they can ask about following Jesus and have opportunity to follow him and to know him and to be nurtured, despite the difficult reasons by which they came. Looking at that with kingdom eyes in the church, I think can be very challenging for some churches. Some churches are further on in that, and for some churches this is a new thing that they're grappling with. So these what you've explained is really helpful, and it's helpful for when we watch the news as well to think about the different reasons why people come. And I know your beloved continent of Africa, where you spent many years. You have spoken to us at Welcome Churches about how it will be the missionary epicenter, really, of the future. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on what you think is happening within the church in the future, and how African Christians are having a part in that.
One of the remarkable differences between Africa and the rest of the world is that basically the decline in birth rates is beginning to take hold all over the world. The few exceptions are some Muslim countries, but mainly the countries of Africa. And many African countries are going to massively grow in population because of the high birth rate. For instance, Niger in the Sahel, it's a semi-desert country or a desert country, but every woman on average has 7 children. And that is massively increasing the population, and the country can't support them. So where are they going to go? Quite apart from warfare and civil unrest and so on. And so we see this challenge. But in the continent of Africa, especially south of the desert areas, there has been a massive turning to Jesus over the past 60 years. Most people don't realize that. I've been in Nigeria and seen some of the conference centers they have there. There's one indigenous church that's very strongly evangelical and has many missionaries in this country. The Redeemed Church have a conference center near Ibadan in Nigeria that can now accommodate 3 million people for Easter weekend for a conference. Where would we think of ever seeing a conference for a weekend for 3 million people? And so Africa in 2050 will be the only youthful continent in the world. Most other countries are going to be struggling to find enough younger people to do the jobs that need to be done to keep the old people alive. Mm. And we're going to have a huge population problem. And we need to be aware of that. But basically, the African church will increasingly be the standard bearer for Christianity. We're already seeing it in our own country. Many missions are now being led by African origin people. We have quite a few We've just had Sentamu, who's been the Archbishop of York, and he was a child of the East African revival. And so we see the life also within the African church that could be useful for the kingdom. And I have contact with many Nigerian missions, and it's amazing to see where they are sending missionaries to today. And so I feel later on in this century, it will be a higher proportion of African missionaries going out than from the West.
And are we seeing already pastors and church leaders from the continent of Africa here in churches in the UK, not just in their own denominations, but in
Yes.
UK specific denominations as well?
Very, very definitely. I just mentioned John Sentamu, the Archbishop of York, but there are many others too.
And in you're doing some research at the moment and writing three papers on the Sahel region of Africa. Can you help our listeners have a bit more understanding? As you say, it's not reported on much, but it's a very key region in terms of migration. So what kind of changes are happening there, and what challenges might impact us here in the UK, as well as impacting perhaps other parts of Africa?
Yeah. Well, I think we need to be humble in what we have done as a nation, and as especially the USA and UK. For instance, we went into Iraq with the idea of getting rid of a dictator, but we did not have a cultural understanding of the local situation and hoped for a solution that was impossible, and we had to retreat with leaving a greater mess than we sought to solve. The same happened in Libya, and we wanted to get rid of a dictator, but it has resulted in civil war that has become internationalized too. But the effect of that is that the weapons have gone over the border of Libya all across the desert of the Sahara, and dissident groups of those who are herdsmen or traders have taken the side of ISIS, and Al-Qaeda, which have taken over huge areas in the countries of West Africa, especially those that border the Sahara. And this has caused chaos. I was speaking at a conference in Burkina Faso, just north of Ghana, just before COVID struck. And it was a conference of ministries working in the Sahel. A lot of the people there were African missionaries, as well as Westerners. But one of the factors that came out was how difficult it was to work there. But we have opportunities. The result of the warfare that is going on in that country of Burkina, when I was there were 1 million people internally displaced in Burkina Faso. They've been chased from their homes by the ISIS marauders. And so many of them are so poor they can't get the money to cross the Sahara Desert to escape to Europe. But those who've got a bit of money pay the people smugglers to get across the desert and hoping to get to Europe. So we are going to possibly see over the coming 10 or 15 years, millions of Africans trying to come to Europe. And it's interesting to see that in Italy, in some areas, they've set aside whole deserted villages because Italy's rural population is disappearing.
Yes, and I think we're already seeing that here in the UK, the grappling with migration and with accommodation and with how a country responds to migration, and both initially and in the longer term.
Welcome churches exist to see every refugee welcomed by the local church. Your support enables us to provide a welcome and life-giving community to refugees and people seeking asylum across the UK. People like Maury, who had to leave his home country because he decided to follow Jesus, a decision that had life-threatening consequences for him. Upon arrival in the UK, he was welcomed by his local church, a church trained by welcome churches to give a cross-cultural, trauma-informed welcome. Suddenly, through no choice of his own, Maury was relocated to a different part of the UK. He could have been isolated and cut off from any community at this point, but through our Welcome Network, his church referred him to a new church to say welcome. Maury has seen the love of God's church across the UK, seeing that we are all one big church where refugees are embraced. Could you join with us to see more refugees like Maury welcomed by their local church when they arrive in the UK? Could you consider making a regular financial donation to Welcome Churches to help us see no refugee alone here? Visit welcomechurches.org/donate to give today.
So you've talked a bit really interestingly about African people from African descent and people from the continent of Africa coming here to Europe and really enriching us in the church. We ourselves have opportunities because of people coming to us from Africa and from many other places in terms of both migrants and people seeking refuge here in the UK. What do you think are the opportunities for the UK church to fulfill the Great Commission and opportunities in other ways too, as we welcome and receive people coming from other countries?
Yeah. Many African communities that have migrated to the UK and to Europe have started their own churches with very African culture. But basically, we find that they don't really communicate well with the indigenous population of Europe because their culture is different. Their children are changing. Really, we don't want to see little ethnic churches springing up, which will only die in a year and half a generation because their children won't speak the language of the country from which they come. So I often, if I speak to African cultural churches, please adapt to the British culture. Because if you have a service of 4 hours on a Sunday and people dawdle in an hour after the service begins, that is not going to attract British people. And so to see multicultural churches or intercultural churches emerge is a huge challenge. So I think we need to actually think in terms of the long term and have multicultural teams with Africans, Asians, and indigenous Europeans working together. And that in itself is a witness. And to be able to see churches emerge that have a kingdom culture rather than a British or African or Hong Kong culture. And so I see huge possibilities of cooperative ministry together to see Britain impacted by the gospel, whether it be the immigrant population or whether it's the indigenous population too. It is so essential that we reach out. And we have huge cultural inhibitions as English culture people. We are afraid we might offend. So we tend to sort of hold back. But when you begin to talk to people who've migrated here, the loneliness they have, cut off from their families, no contact with our indigenous population, how are they going to meet? And for churches to actually deliberately set about making immigrants welcome, and that's where Welcome Churches and the ministry that is involved in welcoming missionaries can be such a vital part of preparing the British Church for the future, the very real future when a higher proportion of our population is going to be of another culture in origin.
And so, lots of challenges for the UK church. And thanks for mentioning Welcome Churches there, Patrick. We are seeing a huge amount of growth in interest from churches throughout the whole of the UK in saying, how can we respond to people seeking asylum and refugees? And how can we do church differently? And I think you've mentioned a number of things which are important in terms of not keeping groups of people on their own, helping them integrate so that their next generations, as they become more British, will find a place in the church here in the UK. And how do you think, what's your advice to churches about moving along a journey to create these kinds of intercultural churches that represent their congregations and having this multicultural leadership that you were mentioning. What's that kind of journey going to look like for churches?
It's going to be a very hard and steep learning curve. And one of the factors that also makes it difficult is the instability of the immigrant population. Many of them come as asylum seekers, as refugees of one kind or another, and they just have to live where they're placed or where they can find an opening. Housing is such a terrible issue for anybody who hasn't got a capital to put down on a house or on the council list or whatever it is. It's incredibly difficult. And so you pour a lot of energy into a person for a year, and then he's gone or she's gone and move to another area. But we must still have that input, because we not only want to see people come to Jesus, but to be discipled and to become leaders. But basically, in the start, that is why I think the welcome boxes idea of welcome churches, which in actual fact was one of the initiating ministries that launched welcome churches. The idea of being able to meet refugees when they arrive with something that is going to help them integrate or connect with the local population is hugely appreciated. And basically, as friendships emerge, you begin to work for the person as an individual rather than because of where they've come from. And so really, the start is building relationships and showing the love of Jesus. And then God will give the ways that we integrate, how we can help one another, how we can work together later. And so I see this as absolutely vital, that we actually go out of our comfort zone to make the effort. And there are, of course, many things that we can do, many basic things, introducing people to cultures, what the do's and don'ts are for certain cultures. We can give lots of help in that kind of way, but basically, it is a huge challenge.
It is, you're right. And some churches are well ahead on that journey, and they've been thinking about it for a long time. And other churches, even churches in our network that we hear from, sometimes a hotel has been opened right in their neighborhood and they have no experience of welcoming people cross-culturally or having people from other cultures in their church. And suddenly, here comes one person, and then that person brings their friends. And before they know it, they've got a much more multicultural congregation, and they're grappling with how can we have everyone represented in the songs that we sing or the way that we do church? How can we really help people to be properly involved in our congregation as believers alongside us, even though perhaps their English may not be fluent, or even though perhaps they're still in the asylum system and they might get moved this week or next week without notice. But how can we do that well now with who God has brought this week and this month? Lots of challenges there. And we do hear lots of hostile vocabulary as well in the media towards immigration, particularly towards refugees, which is very often devoid of compassion and humanity, and is just, people in churches even are finding it difficult to say, how do we think that through? How do we work that through? And thinking about how Britain is and the challenges that migration brings, but also to say for us as Christians, how can we think through a kingdom mindset? How can we think in a kingdom way as we look at practical things, but we also want to reflect Christ? What can you say that would help us as we work through that as individuals and as church communities?
Incredibly difficult. And of course, we need some kind of system, but I get hurt by this when refugees are said to be illegal refugees. How can you be illegal when there's no legal way to come? And
when you have the legal rights to claim asylum as well.
Yes, absolutely. And so I think we also need to realize, even as we look at our politicians, it's interesting to see how migrant origin people rise to the top as well. And it seems entirely acceptable that we have a South Asian prime minister. And I'm glad that very little has been said in a negative way about it. But basically, our country has been enriched. And we are not facing the same crisis that many European countries are. Our population is not declining. And we are better able to look to the future without it being a mad race to find solutions for too many old people. It'll still be a challenge, and I'm one of them. But so there's but that is what's happening in many European countries. They don't have the population to support the old people. But in Britain, things are not as they should be, but it is better.
And as Christians, as churches, and we look at this, what are the kind of perhaps examples in Scripture, or how would you guide Christians to look at the Bible and look through the lens of God's kingdom at what's happening?
Yeah, it's amazing to me how much the Bible, Old Testament and New, has such strong words to say about how we treat the stranger, those who are of other ethnic groups. It's just a beautiful thing to see how God designed this, that we have that responsibility. So much of what Jesus did, I mean, the way he treated the Samaritans, they were undesirable immigrants of 800 years before, but they were still regarded as immigrants and unpopular. Think of the parables of Jesus about Samaritans and how he treated them. And so the message of Scripture is absolutely plain. We should reach out to them and speak up for them. Of course, we have to be wise in the way we do it. I think we can take political action in a way that may not be appropriate, but I think we must have that real compassion and humanity and seek to ensure that all our laws and our politicians have that.
Great. And I know that it's your heart to give the church hope rather than fear about the future. And I know this is very much the heart of your book, The Future of Global Church. Can you just kind of give us a snippet of what excites you about the future for the church, especially the church here in the UK, thinking about all this migration? What's exciting for the church?
I think we have to look beyond our own situation. We look at the declining numbers going to church, which is dropping quite significantly, both here and in the States and all over Europe. But that is exceptional, because what has been happening in Latin America, Africa, and many parts of Asia, there's been this astonishing harvest. In fact, as I worked with Operation World, one of the things that amazed me was to see how we have been actually living through what we could call an awakening. A revival is when churches come to new life, a revived life. An awakening is when whole populations turn to Jesus who've never been involved in Christianity before. And that awakening has really hit the South America, many parts of Africa, and some parts of Asia. And so we're seeing God at work. We have hope for the future. We may not have the turning at the levels that we had during the 1990s, which was quite exceptional. But one of the reasons for that is that there are fewer children being born now. The rapid drop in the birth rate in many countries is astonishing. And it's mostly young people and children who come to Jesus. So we have a big challenge to win adults, but that we must still do. But let's keep the wider picture in mind, that God is bringing about a completion of what we call the Great Commission, that great sending out to make disciples out of every race, tribe, people, and tongue. That's what we want to do. And it is an achievable goal. And I see the conclusion of that is well within sight. I don't know if you ever use sat-nav in your car, but it's always a joy to see that white and black checkered flag for your destination appear on your screen. You know you're getting there. I see that white and black checkered flag for the completion of the job Jesus gave us to do. And so let's go on and finish the job.
That's hugely encouraging. Thank you for that. And just kind of coming to a close now, there's so much on each of these questions. We could have spoken for a lot longer, but what kind of actions do you think would you like to see Christians in the UK and churches in the UK take in terms of responding to migration, in terms of responding to the Great Commission? What would you like to see happening in the church here?
One thing that saddens me is that over the last 20 years, we've rapidly moved to a once-a-week church life in many cases. And this means there's very little chance for Christian workers to speak in a pulpit. And as a result, mission has come to mean something far more local than it should. Jesus gave us a vision for the whole world, and I'd love to see a greater vision for the whole world, and that by implication means those who come from all over the world, which is one of the most effective ways of reaching the rest of the world. Mobile phones are a most incredible tool. The first thing a refugee does when they come to a shore where they want to find refuge is to pull out their phone, tell their relatives, take photographs of it. That's the world we live in.
Yeah.
And so everything is instantly communicable. So a global vision will result in people still going out to where they're needed and to welcome those who come from those countries. And that's what I'd love to see. I'd love to see a world vision that would then also embrace the refugees that come to our shore.
Great. And I do have one other question, actually, in terms of being related to that. What part do you think people who are coming, who are from a refugee or seeking asylum here, those that come and either already know Christ and his follower or become a follower of him, what part do they have in the church in terms of the future of the church here in the UK and perhaps even that part of the church that you were just speaking about, reaching other people? So what part do you hope they have, or can you see them having within the church?
Well, what would be the ideal is that every local congregation be a reasonable reflection of the population in which they are ministering. And so if there's 20% non-Indigenous British in the local area of the church, there should be 20% of the non-local population there as well. And 20% of the leadership should be as well. Once you achieve that kind of equality through every layer of the Christian church, the more likely we are to reflect that we're doing a good job and that we can become a multicultural team to more deeply affect the world.
The great, love to see that too, and love to see the gifts that people bring from other cultures as each culture reflects God and reflects God in different ways and different parts of Scripture as we all come together and are much more enriched by meeting each other and by having people on our leadership teams that reflect the different aspects of God's kingdom and his culture as expressed in our lives. That would be very exciting to be part of. And I think we look forward to seeing much more of that in the church in the UK. So, Patrick, thank you so much for your time today. We have just touched a tiny bit on lots of really big topics, but we hope for the listeners it's been really inspiring and give you lots of food for thought on the future of migration and how it's going to affect us as a church.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Love the Stranger podcast, a podcast brought to you by Welcome Churches. You can find out more about Welcome Church's work, including how to donate, at welcomechurches.org. Please like, review, share and subscribe to our podcast to help us spread the word.